Hello and welcome again from St Francis Vicarage here in Mayheath in Stoke-on-Trent. Today we're continuing our series of talks on the problem of suffering and evil and whether or not God can be held responsible for them. Even does it call into question the very existence of God? Last week we considered the theodicy of St Augustine of Hippo, the towering intellectual genius of the Western Church of late antiquity. Today, we'll be examining a much less well-known person of a couple of centuries earlier, St Irenaeus, and what he had to say about the problem. St Irenaeus of Lyon, in Roman Gaul, modern France, was actually from the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and was probably born in around 125-130 AD. Dating events this far back in history is a notoriously difficult task, so there's little surprise in the fact that we're not exactly certain of the year of this man's birth. He was born in Asia Minor, probably Smyrna, and that's in modern Turkey. And as a young man, he grew up in an area where Christians were relatively numerous and where the memory of the apostolic age was recent and still strong. Indeed, Irenaeus himself was heavily influenced by St Polycarp, the Bishop of Smyrna, who as a boy had learned the faith from St John, the Apostle of Jesus himself. Actually, it was Polycarp who sent Irenaeus to Lyon, then the principal city of Gaul, to work with other Asian missionaries to that region, and he ultimately succeeded as the second Bishop of Lyon. Although there's little certainty about the events surrounding his death, it seems likely that the ancient tradition, which asserts that he died a martyr in around 200 AD, under the Emperor Septimus Severus, is correct. Irenaeus' chief claim to renown, however, was as a major theologian and polemicist. He wrote his work Against the Heresies as a refutation of the ideas of a group called Gnosticism, which was an amalgam of Jewish, Christian and pagan ideas. And it was largely due to this work's wide circulation that Gnosticism, which had been a serious threat to the Church, was given a death blow. Certainly, shortly after Irenaeus' time, Gnosticism ceased to be the threat that it had been. Now, part of Irenaeus' thought had necessarily to do with the existence of evil and the problem of suffering. Necessarily, as Gnosticism gave a central place to these ideas, these questions, and they therefore required an effective response from Christians. One of the things we must remember, though, in dealing with the Irenaean theodicy, is that Irenaeus was working very much at the cutting edge of theology. He was really the first proper theologian of the Christian world, apart from the biblical writers, and he was thus working on problems which took many centuries to resolve, indeed some of which are largely unresolved to this day, arguably theodicy being one of them. Now, although Gnosticism was more of a movement than a clearly defined religion, it's what we would term an umbrella religion. It contains many schools of thoughts or ideas. The various Gnostic schools of thought do seem to have had certain common features. One of these was an insistence that the material world was the creation of an evil, lesser God, and that consequently the world was itself irredeemably evil and corrupt. Jesus' mission as a purely spiritual entity, having, as was generally held, only the appearance of fleshly humanity, always a temptation for some Christians. The old line in the Christmas hymn, "Veiled in flesh his manhood see," is a faint echo of these early ideas. His job, if you like, his task, was to provide certain secret knowledge. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge, and this was to enable the initiate to pass safely from this evil world through various heavenly realms guarded by spirits into paradise, where an entirely spiritual existence was to be lived with the good God of the New Testament. Irenaeus saw that the Bible, and particularly the book of Genesis, clearly taught that the world and its contents and inhabitants were created good by God, but he also had to face the fact that it contains evil and suffering. His problem was how to square this particular circle in such a way as to provide an answer to the Gnostics and reassurance to Christians who might be tempted to fall for Gnostic explanations. His response to evil might be characterized as, God did it, but. Basing his ideas on an exegesis of Genesis 1:26-27, Irenaeus insisted that God was the sole creator of all that is, including humanity as the summit of creation. The key to his thought here lies in the words of the text. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Image and likeness. Now, Irenaeus spoke and wrote in Greek, and was used to the ways in which Greeks use language. For him, image and likeness were quite obviously two distinct things. However, the Old Testament had originated in a Semitic thought world, which had its own linguistic rules and habits. In Hebrew, these two terms are Selem and Demuth, though there are other terms used elsewhere. Now, we've no need here to enter into a protracted discussion of the etymology of these terms. Suffice to say that, in general Hebraic usage, the juxtaposition of these two terms didn't indicate two distinct separate things, but was actually a way to reinforce the meaning of the word. That was normal, and it can easily be seen in the book of Psalms, which frequently employs this language form, and it may readily be observed even in English translation. It's also a commonplace in the wisdom literature of the Bible. It's highly unlikely that Irenaeus understood this, lacking a knowledge of Hebrew, and the adventurous use he makes of these terms is actually quite brilliant, and indeed fortuitous for the development of Christian theology. Irenaeus held that humanity was created in the image, and generally this is referred to in theology by the Latin term imago Dei, the image of God. But humanity was created with a capacity to develop into the likeness of God, and the Latin term for this that we use is similitudo Dei, the likeness. Now, what did this image, imago, consist of, and how did it differ from the likeness, the similitudo? Quite obviously, the image of of God in man could not consist of physical resemblance as such, as God does not possess a body but is entirely spiritual. Although, as an aside, this can open up a very interesting line of thinking which wasn't developed many centuries later. The image of God, for Irenaeus, is to be found in the wholeness of the human person, and in particular in man's intellectual, moral and spiritual capacities. We're created with these and with the capability of using them in the free will, which is part of the image and is God's great gift to us. And we use it to come, ideally, into the fullness of the likeness of God, which is definitively found in Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity. The likeness consists in the possession of theosis, becoming by grace what God is by nature, insofar as created beings can be. Now, whilst we cannot reach the full likeness of God in this world, we can make progress towards it, and indeed, that is what is to be a saint. Why then, if God created the world, and he created it, as the Bible says, very good, why is there evil and suffering in the world? Now, with regard to moral evil, Irenaeus saw this come about because we freely choose to misuse our God-given gift of free will. Instead of ordering our lives towards God through our neighbour, we allow ourselves to be seduced by greed, pride, desire, and all these other bad things. We put ourselves at the centre of life. We thus bring about all the moral evils of this world, and thus bringing about immense human suffering. And yet humans can also act to mitigate these evils through acts of charity and compassion, enabling us to grow towards the likeness, to become more like God. Thus, moral evil and suffering, bad though they are, have an educative value at the very least, helping us to move towards our ultimate destination. When we see evil being perpetrated, we can react in a good, in a loving and compassionate way. So much for moral evil. What of natural evil? Well, God has created this world to be a school or arena in which we can grow towards his likeness. It has to be a world in which suffering is possible, precisely because it must have the conditions enabling us to learn and display the qualities needed for such growth. As such, the world has to be a place in which suffering and pain are possible. Imagine a world in which no pain could be caused. Might sound attractive, but there could be no science, because there could be no abiding physical laws. If I drop a melon from my height, it explodes. But in such a world, someone falling from a cliff will be gently wafted to the ground unharmed. The law of gravity couldn't really apply. A bullet might dissolve into water on contact with the human body and so forth, but punch a hole in the target. Moral actions would be meaningless. I might as well greet someone by slitting their throat as by shaking their hand, because no harm could be caused. And what of death itself? Would we all be immortal? For Irenaeus, such ideas are preposterous because they do not permit God's primary design to happen. The world is a place of soul-making, and thus it's necessary for it to be a place in which real harm can happen. For only in such a world is the necessary human development possible. Now, humanity, unlike for the later Augustine, is not created perfect and then falls from this perfection. Rather, God has deliberately created us as imperfect, but capable of growth into perfection, both at an individual level and as a species, albeit this requires life after death as a necessary condition. It is because Irenaeus holds that all people will ultimately attain the likeness of God in heaven that he is a universalist, that is, one who does not believe that anyone will be consigned to hell forever, but that no matter how evil they may be in this world, they'll be transformed through continued learning and growth in what later generations term purgatory, until they at last reach heaven and the likeness of God. Now, Irenaeus has, in the West at least, always been overshadowed by the towering reputation of Augustine, and in consequence, his ideas fell out of favour for many centuries. Moreover, access to the original Greek was restricted. By Augustine's time, most Western authors knew only Latin, and so had to rely on translations, and we have to remember all books had to be written by hand. And indeed, the only complete text is in Latin, and it's of disputed date. However, within the last 50 years or so, his ideas have received a resurgence in popularity, particularly through the work of the British theologian John Hick, who lived from 1922 to 2012. His ideas have appealed to a generation or two which have largely rejected the traditional notions of judgment and hell, and see in the idea of progress from an imperfect state to one in which there is development into the likeness of God, greater correspondence to modern so-called scientific beliefs and evolutionary theory, which has always been a barrier to faith for many people, Christians included. However, in spite of these factors, Irenaeus' theory does not escape difficulties. Whilst it's very, very attractive, it has its problems. Now, I don't intend to present an exhaustive list, but these include, firstly, number one, if you like, belief in the ultimate redemption of all people is problematic. Although Irenaeus lived before this belief was definitively condemned by the Fifth Ecumenical at Constantinople in 553 AD, nevertheless, it was never really part of mainstream Christianity. It's problematic because, not least, Jesus didn't believe in it, and his recorded words make clear the eternity of hell and the fact that many people will go there. I know it makes us feel uncomfortable, we don't like it, but tough, it's in the Bible. Moreover, such universalist ideas fail to take seriously human free will. If at the end one is forced into heaven, how does this respect free will? Would this not mean that at the end of the day it's an illusion? How does it take seriously that the scriptural insistence that this world is the place of decision, and after death it's too late to change one's mind? Moreover, if all eventually attain heaven, what's the motivation for doing moral acts in this life? It wouldn't really matter, I'll get to heaven anyway. Is not Christian missionary work commanded by Christ an unnecessary burden on the church and its people, if at the end of the day it ultimately makes no difference? Secondly, for Irenaeus, God deliberately maintains a distance from humanity so that there's room for disbelief in his existence. Hick refers to this as an epistemic distance, where we cannot tell if God exists, thus allowing us free will. Yet much of the Christian theological tradition holds that whilst God does permit a certain ambiguity regarding his distance, the dice are loaded. He makes it possible for us to know of it, and at least some of his character and moral requirements, through the use of our own reason. In Irenaeus, this would appear to have less force, again, contrary to scriptural witness. In the third place, Irenaeus would seem to offend against basic principles of justice. The immense suffering caused to the innocent by deliberate human actions seemed to demand punishment. Although universalism does not in itself rule out the idea of a period of punishment, its limited duration clearly goes against the words of Jesus and other scriptural testimony, as well as our innate sense of the requirements of justice in the face of atrocities such as Auschwitz or Rwanda. In the fourth place, it makes of God a moral monster. At the end of the day, it makes him responsible for the deliberate creation of evil and suffering. It's a central principle of Christian ethics that the ends do not justify the means. It's never right to do what's intrinsically wrong in order that good may come about. Yet, Irenaeus has God do exactly this. Suffering results in moral growth. It's undoubtedly true for some, but for others, suffering leads to moral degradation into despair. We're all familiar with this sort of criminal defence that says, sorry my lord, I fell on my head when I was a baby. That is, I'm not responsible. Suffering made me the monster I am. It's been shown to have some basis in fact in the case of paedophilia, for instance. And also, does the suffering, say, of a child really lead the world to becoming a better place? How can a child, a baby, learn from suffering? Wouldn't that make of the child something to be used perhaps for other people's ends? And then fifthly, Irenaeus seems to assume that only suffering leads to moral growth. But is that true? Would it not be possible for God to use such things as sporting challenges, academic competition, and so forth to allow us to learn the necessary virtues without undergoing suffering? And finally, what role is there in this idea for Jesus Christ? In this scheme, he seems to be brought in as a moral example and nothing else. What's the point of his sacrifice? Why the cross? This scheme appears to fly in the face of all that Christians have held about the incarnation and atonement. So really, however attractive it may at first sight be, this theodicy seems to be a long way from being traditionally Christian. Now, of course, other criticisms are well possible, but these will suffice for our purposes. We can see that in spite of the attractiveness of certain of Irenaeus' ideas, there are nevertheless problems. So let's come to a conclusion. Although an Irenaean theodicy seems at first sight to be attractive, particularly to an age steeped in almost religious devotion to science, and eager to avoid what it sees as being the unremitting cruelty of a doctrine of an eternal hell, it actually raises a considerable number of challenges of its own, not the least being that it flies in the face of the simple word of God contained in the Scriptures, that's been promoted by an infallible ecumenical council and affirmed by universal Christian tradition. It also seems to leave very little place for the unique ministry of Jesus Christ, and it's also largely a repudiation, although he wouldn't see it as such, of the sacramental system of the Church. However appealing it may be then, It seems to have little place in traditionally understood Christianity, and at least begs question in a number of respects. Now, none of this is to deny that Irenaeus was a great bishop, theologian, and saint. He can't be blamed for working out responses to complex questions when he was writing at the very start of the enterprise. It's no fault of his that later generations would uncover deficiencies in his ideas. Next week, in the final part of this course, we should turn to give particular attention to the essential place of Jesus Christ as God's definitive response to the problem of evil and suffering. So please join us. Thank you for joining us today, and do remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on our Facebook page. May God bless you all at this time.